In this video lecture we're going to address the question of the word feminist and thinking about its meanings and whether we might want to identify within it. The dictionary definition of feminism is quite frequently used. According to Merriam-Webster, the belief that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities. Also, organized activity in support of women's rights and interests. The two elements there I think are important. One is a belief in equality, the other is activity in support of equality. So right from the beginning, feminism includes both what thoughts people might have and what they do. Beyonce gives us a fantastic definition quoted from the writer Adichie, a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. These for me are kind of minimum definitions of feminism. I think that if you believe these things, you don't necessarily have to be a feminist. Some people will say, look, if you believe in the equal rights of the sexes, then you must be a feminist. I actually don't agree with that rhetoric. I think there are some good reasons not to identify as a feminist, even if you do believe in the equality of the sexes. Another way to frame this minimal definition is it just means not being an asshole. A commonly cited quote, although a problematic one, from Rebecca West: "I myself have never been able to find out what feminism is. I only know that people call me a feminist whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat or a prostitute." That last comment there, or a prostitute, is often cut out of the quote because it's very anti-sex work, and of course sex workers are quite capable of expressing sentiments that differentiate themselves from doormats and make them wonderful feminists, and often do. A less problematic way of expressing the same thing, this is a quote from an Australian feminist called Sue. It's from the book Manifesta. "Feminists are just women who don't want to be treated like shit." Feminists have often found, or women have often found, that when they express sentiments advocating for their minimal humanity, they're given the label feminist. Talking of which, here are some other very powerful definitions, I think. Feminist is someone who believes women are human beings, from Atwood, or feminism is the radical notion that women are people, from Scheer. I like these definitions. I think that they're a good way to think about feminist theory in terms of reframing and undermining the idea that women are somehow a separate species of humans, that they're a different class, that different rules apply to them. And instead, if we think of women as just human beings, as we think of them as just people, that really dissolves a lot of the claims that misogynists, chauvinists will make about women. This is an effective definition, I think. Feminism is somewhat interesting historically in that originally it wasn't the term used as a self-description by feminists at all. It was used as an attack. You don't see any feminists of what is known as the first wave referring to themselves as feminists, but it got picked up by the movement, reappropriated, as many words have been. Here's some good quotes from male rights activists, anti-feminists. First is from Rush Limbaugh. "Feminism was established so as to allow unattractive women access to the mainstream of society." And then this delightful quote, which makes for a good bumper sticker, from Pat Robertson: "Feminism is a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians." I'm actually in favor of several of those things. But it's worth having a sense of the way in which feminism has been defined by the enemies of women's rights. Feminazi, of course, is another famous term connected to this, also from Rush Limbaugh. Here's the definitions I like the most, and these position feminism in terms of what it challenges, what it's against. And what it's against is unequal power structures. This quote from Starhawk: "Feminism is about challenging unequal power structures." And then a very widely used definition from Bell Hooks from Feminist Theory from Margin to Center. This is, simply put, feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. From Feminism is for Everybody by Bell Hooks: "The soul of our politics is the commitment to ending domination." I like these definitions of feminism because they put it in the context of the fact of inequality, of domination, of supremacy, and trying to fight against those structures. Many people who we now label as feminists have actually organized under other terms. Women's rights was the main term used in the 19th century. Women's liberation, or women's lib, was very commonly used in the middle of the 20th century. There was a movement from African American women predominantly to organize around the banner of womanism. The idea was that, unlike feminism, womanism would appreciate the ways in which womanliness, or the fact of being a woman, was important to women, rather than kind of minimizing the experiences of women as women. This included the importance of family, the importance of loving men in the lives of many of these women. There's also been attempts to include feminism within humanism, which is a long-running philosophical movement, also egalitarianism. Today, these are actually often used as attacks, suggestions to ignore feminism, to say that, well, why do you call yourself a feminist? You should just be a humanist, or you should just be an equalist. The problem with that is that it ignores the way in which oppression has been sexed, has been directed particularly at women, which is an important element of feminism. It's not claiming that women deserve something different in the final outcome, it's claiming that the fact is that there is difference now and we need to address that. At the same time, there are people we would now label feminists who have organized under these banners historically. A more common term in the modern movement is to describe people as acting for social justice. There's actually an anti-social justice attack from right-wingers on the internet where they refer derogatorily to people as social justice warriors. I actually really like this term, and I think it's ripe for appropriation. So I recommend it to you. Among its merits is that it pisses off the right wing. Whether or not someone chooses to identify as a feminist, I think there are some common elements to all of these definitions that are worth considering. The first is they all care about justice, they care about equality, they care about rights. Those are not all the same things, but broadly speaking, they care about the ethics of people's situation in society. Talking of which, they all have a sociological perspective. That is to say, they understand wide, broad social forces, understanding human beings in groups and how those groups interact with each other. I think all definitions of feminists should be activists. That is, they take into account the fact that we are asking for change and working towards change. I think feminism calls you towards something. They also, obviously, care about sex and gender. As I mentioned, that's why I think humanism and equalityism, or whatever you call it, aren't great terms for this movement. Sex gender is complicated and feminists have different approaches to it, but in some respect they think that it's important in understanding oppression. For me, an important fact about whether someone labels themselves a feminist or not is when you do label yourself a feminist, for good and bad, you're drawing a connection to a movement. You're drawing a connection to women who have described themselves as feminists, to women who have been described as feminists. That includes some women who have been awful in many ways, in particular at failing in intersectionality, women who have been racist, women who have been colonialist. It also includes many wonderful, amazing women that are something to be really proud of and something that is powerful to connect ourselves in a community. So for me, that's the fundamental thing that goes on when someone calls themselves a feminist. It's not about any of these particular claims or dictionary definitions. It's about owning this movement and saying, you know what, I'm a part of it. That includes some recognition of the ways in which the movement has failed, and also some celebration of the way the movement succeeded. It also, I think, includes a commitment to activism within the movement, to improving the movement, to challenging the ways in which the movement has shortcomings, and trying to address those and advance the movement. There are several theories, ideas that fall broadly under the banner of critical studies. Marxist studies, which has somewhat gone out of fashion today to mention Marx, is actually sometimes referred to as critical studies. Marx is one of the first sociologists that really thinks about society in terms of there being these large groups or classes that hold macro, large-scale positions of power in contrast to each other. So Marx is really important in terms of framing all of these ways of thinking about society. And although we often don't talk about it, some of the basics of Marx's ideas, although there's lots of problems with the details that have been changed and addressed, but some of the basics of the ideas are really fundamental to a lot of what we're thinking about. Critical race theory comes out of scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw, is a really important part of thinking about the way in which we understand structures of oppression within society. Post-colonial theory looks at the legacy of colonialism, the system of international imperialism and oppression of between nations in the 20th century and the 19th century, and looks at the ways we can undo that, decolonize. Transnational feminism or transnationalism looks at the authors like Chowdhury, for example, looks at the way in which we need to understand the differences between women and oppressed people, between nations across the world, and also the ways in which they can work together. Recently, queer and LGBT studies has become increasingly prominent within critical studies, providing some important frameworks for rethinking some of our ways of thinking about oppression and groups. And finally, disability studies is very important in terms of thinking about the ways in which we understand the human body, the ways in which we understand the rational person as a subject that receives rights, and really is on the cutting edge, along with queer studies, of rethinking the ways in which we address oppression. I think an important thing to consider is the way in which women's studies requires or does not require a commitment to feminism. In some ways, feminism is to women's studies as the theory of evolution is to biology. So many of the writers and theorists within women's studies take feminism as their foundational understanding of the way the world works, that to reject it makes it almost impossible to engage seriously in women's studies scholarship. At the same time, feminism is a political commitment, and an intellectual or academic subject has an awkward relationship with having a political commitment as its core. In some ways, when we think about truth and academic truth, we don't think about that as being the same as political or ethical truth, right? You can't prove, for example, that women are human beings with full ethical status in the same way that you can prove an equation in mathematics. Rather, that's something that as feminists we take as, or as women's studies scholars, we take as a starting point, as an assumption that we're going to base our ideas off of this belief in the ethical value of women as. So while someone can certainly be a successful scholar within women's studies while not labeling themselves a feminist, as I said, I think the most compelling reason not to do so is because of the shortcomings of the movement to which that term connects you. But I do think that in order to be a successful women's studies scholar, you do need to accept some of the fundamentals that go into that definition. The idea that women are meaningfully equal people, are human beings, have an ethical status, that we need to work in important ways to address that there are widespread social inequalities that require analysis.